going back over the class. So we've been here 15 weeks and covered a lot of material. So Intro Psych is quite different probably from what you thought it was in advance. Here's some of the things from the first third or so of the course, things you ought to be reviewing that are important themes from the course. First part of the course had an emphasis on philosophy of science. We talked about what is an explanation. Explanation has to satisfy 5 philosophical criteria. It's deductive. That meant we had to talk about what do we mean by deduction and induction. What are the different types of statements and so on. It's deductive, it's meaningful, it's predictive, causal, and general. And we discovered that some theories, that some people aren't aware of this, I mean most people in psychology are aware. Freud's theory is not considered a scientific theory. It's only taught for basically historical reasons these days. It's taught because it's in the pop literature, it's part of our culture now. The English courses that you take, they have you use Freud's theory to analyze the motivation of Hamlet. You can understand the Big Bang Theory. Anybody see the latest episode of Big Bang Theory? Sheldon's mother versus Leonard's mother, the battle. Some people are smiling. Like, anybody see the Big Bang Theory this latest time? Well, I get a chance to see it. It's a, you know what Sheldon's mother is like, right? She's the Bible thumper. You know what Leonard's mother's like? She's the psychoanalyst. And so she's applying all this Freudian terminology. Anyhow, if you haven't seen it, it's funny. Why do you study Freud theory today? Well, it's useful for insults. But is it a useful scientific theory? Can you make predictions with it? No. Is it useful as a therapy? No. Turns out that the therapy is more harmful than good. So what's wrong with it as a theory? What do you need a theory to be? Meaningful. But it fails on that criterion. That's the second criterion. It's got to be testable. If it isn't testable, it isn't saying anything. Remember, I want you to be skeptical and open-minded. Skeptical means you ask, what does it mean, and how do we know? What does it mean means how would you test it, and what's the evidence? Is there evidence for this or not? Evaluate the arguments and the evidence. So people make statements all the time. You want to be able to evaluate them. Now, you'll remember that Freud's theory is now, no longer considered worthwhile in psychology as a scientific theory. It's part of pop psych, part of our culture, but it's not really considered part of psychology. You can't use it to predict what a child would be like. You don't really know how to raise kids. It says various things about child rearing, but if you wean the kid this way, they're going to end up being a gum chewer, or they're going to be a big talker, or they're going to be a stutterer, or they're going to not be able to speak, or they're going to speak too much. They're going to be an overeater or an undereater. You can't really tell. How do you traumatize a kid? They don't have a clear theory about how to do it, or what to expect if you did. But you should be able to recognize the principle, because these new theories, it isn't just Freud is the only one came up with a theory like that. People are inventing these theories all the time that don't say anything. So you need to be skeptical enough to be able to recognize them when they come at you. And they will come at you, and you will hear them in some of your university courses. You should ask yourself, what's the difference between this and the theory of unverifiable brownies? Now, I guarantee you, 40 years from now, you will remember the theory of unverifiable brownies. Don't look at me blank. You'll remember the theory of the unverifiable brownie. And you should be able to tell what's the difference between this theory and brownie theory. So you've got to be able to recognize the brownie theory. If I say there's a brownie here, you have no way of knowing. If I say there's a $100 bill here, you can tell. You know what I'm saying. Now, big principle is causation versus correlation. So do not be suckered into thinking that evidence of correlation has anything whatsoever to do with evidence for causation. there was absolutely nothing, no connection between the two, but you're suckered in all the time. Matter of fact, some people will cite a coincidence, as if it's coincidence is even less than a correlation. Coincidence is just something like this. Well, I knew 13 people who had been vaccinated and then got the measles, or who hadn't been vaccinated but didn't get any measles, you know. These are coincidences, a coinciding of two things that happen. There's a chemical factory in Danville, Illinois, that shut down. And the cancer rate per person, the number of people with cancer in Danville, is higher than it is in the rest of the state. The chemical factory closed down in 1950. A lot of people are ready to jump to the conclusion that the chemical factory had something to do with the higher cancer rate. Turns out that the cancer rate per person, if you correct for the age of the people, is the same in Danville. What happened when the chemical factory shut down? All the young people began moving away to get jobs. Once the factory closed, the only people who were left were the retirees. And older people, believe it or not, are more likely to get cancer than younger people. So there was a coincidence that some people thought meant something. Don't jump to conclusion because there's a coincidence. A happened and then B happened, therefore A must have caused B to happen. How do you distinguish causation and correlation? You randomly assign people to conditions. Now Jenny McCarthy says, a coincidence is enough to prove causation. Why, my child got an inoculation against measles and then became autistic. Well, we know a lot of people that didn't get an inoculation and got autistic, right? What happens if you do an experiment? Randomly assign people to conditions, give some of them a vaccination and some of them no vaccination, and compare the two groups. Is there any difference in the rate of autism? Turns out no. Is there a difference in the death rate? Yes, favoring the group that got the inoculation. Your child is more likely to survive if you get the inoculation than if you don't. Less likely to get measles. Not more likely to get autism. Was there a case of a child that got an inoculation and had a bad reaction? Yes, 1 out of 1.2 million in one of the studies who got an inoculation had like a brain reaction to it, went into seizures. But one kid in the control group also, who did not get an inoculation, also had seizures out of 1.2 million who did not get an inoculation. So some people will say, oh, but we know of these cases of people that had a bad reaction after getting the shot. But you had a lot of people who got a bad reaction who did, after not getting the shot. That's the control group. To tell if something actually is doing something, you need the control group in there. Random assignment to conditions. You have an independent variable. Independent variable is the treatment versus the placebo. You have a dependent variable. How long do people live, or what is their likelihood of dying, or how long does it take them to recover from the disease? When you randomly assign people to conditions and you bleed people that have my symptoms, you're more likely to die when you bleed them than when you don't bleed them. So it's not a good idea. That's what they did to George Washington. So causation and correlation are two completely different things, but they're both useful. The insurance company cares about both causation and correlation. Based on the experiment, you're running an insurance company and you've insured somebody, got life insurance on them, and they get a strep throat. What do you tell them to do? They can't take the penicillin, take the antibiotics, because we know it reduces your chance of death. Causes a reduction in the probability of death. On the other hand, if you're just trying to predict something, you say, you know, I'm thinking about insuring somebody, but he took a lot of penicillin last year, don't sell him insurance, because you can predict. The correlation goes in the opposite direction of the causal relationship. It's often the case. It may go in the same direction, may go in the opposite direction, and maybe there's no connection. Could be a zero correlation and a causal effect. Every possibility is possible about the relationship between the two. So they're basically, the basic rule is don't believe it. Class size. bigger classes get better scholastic performance in a correlational study because, well, the honors English class, you can, well-behaved kids, you can have 40 kids in that classroom. And the kids that are troublemakers, you got to put them in small classes, and they don't do well in school. So small classes do poorly, and big classes do well. And so politicians who are in league with the devil, politicians will say, we can save money and cut the Koch brothers' taxes. And by the way, don't confuse the Koch brothers with Robert Koch, the bacteriologist from Germany from the last century. The Koch brothers are two guys that are going to try to buy the next election. They're willing to spend $1 billion, as much as both political parties spent on the last election. They personally are going to spend on the next election, trying to elect somebody so they can control the government of the United States. There's no law against it, apparently, but they're already announcing it. That's why there's so many people running for president right now. Well, don't confuse the Koch brothers with Robert Koch. We know from causal studies that the germs are causing a disease. We know that the penicillin is killing the germs. We know that randomly assigning people to conditions to receive the penicillin or not, the people are more likely to live. In the class size study, correlationally, big classes look good and small classes look bad. Causally, if you randomly assign people to conditions, the small classes look good. So you get opposite results, and you don't want to fall. But what correlation is useful? Because it's useful for prediction. Causation is useful because it tells you about how to control something, how to change something, how to make something happen. Well, that's the difference between an experiment and a survey. A survey is measure where you just measure things and correlate them and ask, you can predict from X to Y or Y to X. Or you're trying to predict something. What are some of the things we want to predict in psychology? Well, one of them has been in the news this semester. Wouldn't you like to be able to predict if some pilot is going to get depressed and crash your plane? That happened this semester, right? The German Air Wings pilot, I don't know if you guys paid attention to this, it just happened just a little while ago. The guy was depressed. The FAA wrote him a letter and said, I don't know if we should give you a license. You're depressed. You have major depression. His psychiatrist wrote a letter saying, he's cured now. He's all better. Let him become a pilot. He became a pilot, went for the ride. He adjusted he's the co-pilot. The pilot went to the bathroom. He locked the door, turned the automatic pilot to the altitude of 100 feet. He had actually practiced it once before, but they didn't catch it in time. He set the thing to 100 feet, crashed the plane into the Alps, and took about another 160 people or so with him. People are saying, oh yeah, but it's only 37 times this has happened that a pilot has crashed the plane and killed other people, so we shouldn't worry about it. It's only happened 37 times, but people get interested in stuff like that. Shouldn't you psychologists be worrying about predicting human behavior? Shouldn't you want to know in advance whether or not some guy is going to do that before you let him become a pilot and have other people's lives controlled by what they're going to do? So correlation is important because we want to predict. It'd be nice to be able to control and change things, but we also would like to be able to predict things like that. If you're going to predict, which is more accurate, statistical prediction or clinical prediction? In this case, the clinician wrote in a letter saying, oh, I think he's better. Why don't you give him this? So the FAA wrote him a letter saying, okay, now you're allowed to be a pilot. He got to be a pilot, and I guess he got depressed again. So we talked about causation versus correlation. You should understand what's an experiment, what's a survey. You should know all the terms, independent, dependent, variable, the statistical inference, asking, hypothesis testing, the null hypothesis, rejecting the null hypothesis, all that kind of language. That's all in Chapter 2. You should be able to design an experiment to study an effect. I illustrated with the experiment on the famous experiment on the effects of psychotherapy. which is testing largely these talk therapies of the kind that were around a few years ago, some of them directive, some of them non-directive, showing more harm than good. First rule of medicine, do no harm, right? And what was the results of the experiment on the Cambridge Somerville Youth Study? The therapists were causing more harm than good. What do we mean by spontaneous remission? We mean that sometimes you're better off not treating somebody because people have a tendency to get better. So in psychiatry, people, when they appear asking for treatment, they're worse off than they will be a year from then. So there's a tendency for people to get better. People get a cold like this. Hopefully by next week, I forgot to do the Brownian differentiation. Should have done it last week. Remember? Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm hoping by next week I'll be all better. So that spontaneous remission can be helped along by Brownian differentiation, otherwise known as the placebo effect. We talked about clinical versus statistical, and I talked about the Barnum effect, illustrating that self-validation is no validation. So, any questions about that first third of the course or so? Those are some of the big themes we had back then. Questions? You were just drinking water. Any question about that first third of the course? We had a lot of terminology, Freud's terms, and so on. You read about personality theory. Now in the second part of the course we had a kind of statistical emphasis, and you learned a little bit of statistics in here. Right? We had the mean, the median, the mode, the midpoint, how to draw a frequency distribution, how to convert score into a standard score, z-score. We had correlation coefficient, how to calculate it and how to use it to predict. We got the regression equation, and we had an equation expressing the sort of the precision or the degree, the accuracy of the prediction. Talked about tests in general, and of course the psychiatric diagnosis is an example of a test. So a clinical judgment can also be evaluated with respect to reliability, validity, and bias. We applied the reliability, validity, and bias to the IQ test, so we spent a lot of time on IQ testing to illustrate the idea of testing, but everything I'm saying about IQ testing applies to achievement testing, which is what we'll have with the final. That's a measure of whether or not you took the course, basically. And incidentally, before taking this course, people do about chance on the pretest. So the class, I noticed, did about 2.2 on the pretest, so before they took the course. Then they retook basically the same test, and the scores jumped up to 7.8 or something like that. So having taken the course, suddenly people do better. Not an intelligence test. You don't know this material. You have to be exposed to the material to know it. That's a test of achievement. Reliability, validity, and bias though applies to a medical test, to a PSA test, to the prostate test, which, as we now know, is high in reliability but not so high in validity. So medical tests can also be questioned or analyzed this way, high in bias of various types. To a psychiatric diagnosis by a human who's giving a person, who's diagnosing whether a person is a schizophrenic or has another psychiatric or is depressed, like that pilot. So what is reliability? You measure something and measure it again and ask, does the test predict another measurement of the same thing? What's validity? That's a correlation between the test and what it's supposed to measure. And what's bias? That's a systematic error of prediction of what it's supposed to be from the test. Might be related to groups, or it might be a bathroom scale, so related to a standard scale. Your scale is off by 10 pounds, things like that. So we talked about the history of IQ testing. What was it Binet was trying to do? Where did this test come from? What was Binet up to? What was Terman's role in the IQ test and things like that? So we talked a bit about history of psych topics in general, but I talked about that with Galton and the various tests and measures that Galton was making, the first quantitative anthropologist. Talked about Galton's paradox, the heights of fathers versus the sons. The correlation is about 0.5, and the sons are shorter on average than tall fathers, and taller than average than short fathers. That's known as regression, and it has a statistical explanation. Talked quite a bit about IQ testings, reliability, validity, and bias, kinship correlations, identical twins separated at birth, siblings separated at birth, raised together, and adoption studies, and various other things. Talked about controversies in the heredity versus environment, and you should know, of course, all of that. Here's the theory of heredity, here's the theory of the environment. So learning theory, there everything has to do with the stimuli and the history of the stimuli. So why did the rat cross the shock grid? Why did Pavlov's dog salivate when he rang a bell? Things like that. Why did somebody do something? They were reinforced for doing it. So you should know the terms, classical conditioning terms, unconditioned stimulus, conditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned. Be sure you rehearse those, because you'll need to know that terminology, how it's applied in advertising, and everything else. You may want to know about, since a lot of people have dogs and cats and other animals as pets, rats. You can look up all the things that the rat trainers do. They always post, they get their rats to do the greatest things. I don't know if they're going to win an NBA championship, but they're going to come close. What do you think the Clippers are going to do? All right, so you should definitely know learning. I put a star here. This is one of the chapters, learning chapter. The intelligence testing chapter, these had asterisks on them. Those are things you should pay particular attention to. Talked a bit about Binet's student, Piaget, the French-speaking Swiss psychologist. It's kind of the father of modern developmental psychology, who studied the IQ type tasks and asked the question, why is it that as the kid gets older, they get able to answer more questions? What is happening? And he had a particular theory of what's going on. His theory, of course, was that it had to do with biological maturation, not with learning. So development and learning are not the same things. Well, let me just leave it up here. Any questions about various things we did in the second section of the class? How to do any kind of stat problems, anything like that? So in the third part of the course, and again, sensation and perception, I'm putting asterisks on, the biological psych. So those chapters are also been asterisk assigned. We spent some time, some students, when they take intro psych, aren't aware that we're going to do statistics, and some people aren't aware you're going to do some biological psychology, a lot of different kind of topics. Psychology has a lot of variety of material in it that people aren't necessarily expecting. So you should definitely know something about the anatomy and physiology of the nervous system, the structure of the brain, what different parts of the cortex, the cerebrum seem to be associated with, what are the major techniques of physiological psychology and what are their limitations. Definitely ought to know about the split brain research and the hemispheric specialization. Know the difference between what the pop psych authors are saying about hemispheric specialization as opposed to what you actually can conclude from the research. Sensation featured Wallach's theory of Gelb illusion and color constancy. When I talked about audition, vision, spend a little bit of time on olfaction with you. You should know about the classical senses. You should know about the psychophysical parallels. You should know something about physics and physiology of what's out there that people are detecting. So there's vibrations in the air that people experience as sounds. People don't detect all the vibrations. I mean, whales can hear sounds that you don't hear. You don't even think of it as a sound. It's a vibration that's beyond your range of hearing. And you can't hear things you could hear 10 years ago. I mean, one of the depressing things to be is a study of the upper end of your hearing as your college student, because that highest note you can just hear drops every year by several thousand hertz. And so people say, oh, last year you could hear this, but now here's the one you can hear. And last year you could hear this, but now this. So each year you can watch your hearing drop off at the upper end. So the high pitches, there are a lot of things, of course, beyond which even human children don't hear, but dogs and cats can hear, so you know that there are dog whistles that your dogs can hear and respond to. So humans can only perceive part of the spectrum of sound waves, and they can only perceive part of the spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. So the part that we call light is just this tiny little part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We don't see infrared, we don't see ultraviolet, we don't see the X-rays, we don't see the gamma rays, we don't see the microwaves, radio waves. So those are some of the topics from sensation. And then in perception, we talked about, we sort of featured under perception a theory of illusions and constancies. And so I talked about a theory that satisfies the philosophical criteria of a theory that explains the moon illusion, the moon illusion and the Ponzo illusion, the Muller-Lyer illusion, the size of things in stereo, all sorts of other perceptual size type phenomena. And then you ought to know the basic things about memory and cognition. So we had a couple of videos, you had a couple of chapters to read, you had a bit of a lecture about those topics, but social psych and memory and cognition, all these are topics, of course, are things you can take in the upper division. Any questions about the course? Well, we could go on for years covering more material. Yes?
Does the thing you posted online, would you say it covers pretty much everything that you're listening to?
When you say the thing, which...
the practice test that you gave us?
There were several different practice tests. So one of the practice tests was written by a guy named Pinker. I didn't write that, but it was being kicked around on Facebook, and I thought you guys might like it, so I linked it there. It's not very well written questions. Then there's the pre-test that I republished again. So there was just 10 items, so it's not like everything, doesn't cover the entire course, but it's a sample of the course. So it'll give you an idea of what the questions are like. Then there's Callet's test that was 45 items. That gives you a kind of a coverage of Callet, gives you an idea of what Callet expects of things. So these are different representations. And then I posted a list of some of the quiz items and the homework questions that you've had. Those give you really good ideas about what kind of thing. You saw in the midterm, things that have been, if something is presented in the class and in the video and in the homework and in the quiz, if it appears in all these different places. So illusions and constancies would be an example of that. You saw it in the video, I lectured it, I gave it in homework. It's in the website, it was in the, in all the different places it could be, These are things you should expect a lot of questions about. It's something that only appears in one place, like only in the book and never mentioned in class or in a video or in somewhere else. Those are things you wouldn't expect things to be. But yeah, those are all things that should help you prepare. I didn't assign all the quizzes in Callet. I assigned them for a few of the featured chapters because I know if you assign too much stuff, people just don't do it, And so then they stop doing everything, and I'm trying to also give you information about some things are a little more important than others. but doing some of the other chapters wouldn't be harmful to do, besides the ones that are asterisk. There's a lot of stuff in the CALIT that I've linked online that you can do. Flashcards, some people like to do. There's nothing in particular for people to turn in, so I didn't assign that because I don't know how to know what people are doing. I think I got a question coming. Yes?
Are all three segments equally distributed?
Not sure what your question means exactly, but the final exam covers the whole course and more on the things that we haven't tested on yet, so that eventually all the material is going to get tested roughly equally, except that some things are a little more important than others. So some things are important because the next course in the psychology sequences, research methods, and statistics, it's sort of my job to get you ready for those things, So chapter 2 has an asterisk on it. And then there's for the psych majors, certain other things that are coming up with asterisks on them. The oldest part of psychology is perception. I told you the story about Gustav Fechner and Fechner's psychophysics. And so he figures heavily in the history of psychology, and sensation perception is one of the oldest and most important areas of psych. Learning psychology also rates up there as one of the big topics, and was the main topic that was pushed by the behaviorists. Behaviorism was very important. So in the 1940s in American universities, a good part of the course would have been learning, and it would have been a lot of work with rats and pigeons and other animals, and they would have been talking about principles of behavior. Basically, they'd be talking about learning theory. A lot more material has been added to the subject matter, but it's still an important, area of psychology. So the things that I've marked as asterisks, I would say, are more important, but basically everything is going to be covered, if that was your question. Anything else? Yeah.
Would you go back to the first segment?
Back to the first segment. So, 3 parts of the course: philosophy of science, what's an explanation, how do you test things, research methods, beginning of statistics, right, all that kind of stuff. Second part of the course is sort of a statistical emphasis and prediction, right? IQ testing, heredity and environment. So we had theory of heredity, theory of environment. Developmental psych, and the third part of the course is some, with a sort of a biological emphasis, biological psychology, physiological psychology, sensation and perception, and then also some other topics, human memory and cognition, and social psych. Was there a particular question you had about anything else? All right, well, been fun. Well, good luck to everybody. There'll be a review at 4:30 and H622. Good luck with the studying for the rest of your lives, and we'll see you out here on Thursday.